Hi everyone, this is Mike, and I'm here to discuss with you all my review of Mass Effect Andromeda. There's always glare every time. I have spent more time with this game than I have any other game this generation. I have lost sleep over it. I have played it that much. I have completed several games this gen, but none have taken so much more of my time and sucked me in as much as Andromeda did this generation. I'm a huge Mass Effect fan. It was my favorite franchise last generation. I think the characters, the lore, the universe, everything about it was fascinating. So, of course, I was interested in seeing what lies beyond the Milky Way in that universe. So, Andromeda had a lot of potential. And in some ways, it did deliver. In the sense that I did enjoy hanging out with the characters. I did get attached to them over time. Part of the reason I think that the Mass Effect series works so well is that they give you a lot of time to get to know your crew. So you spend hours and hours and hours with them, bonding with them, and that's something that I've always loved about the series. This game, I have a love-hate relationship with. What works, I enjoyed immensely, and I can't remember that. Like I said, this is the first game I've played in a while that I lost sleep over. I was dedicated to completing it and doing all the side missions and doing everything that I could, scanning all the planets and any anomalies I might have found, talking to everybody whenever I could, doing side quests, trying to make all the planets viable. And when the game plays like Mass Effect, when it does the Mass Effect thing, I did enjoy it quite immensely as a fan. However, there are elements that definitely are worth complaining about. First I'm going to talk about the disappointing factors of it, and then we'll talk about the things that I hated. And there are definitely things I hated about it. The biggest disappointment is this game, along with so many games nowadays, went this feels like the beginning of a story route. Now, granted, the original Mass Effect was the beginning of a trilogy, but it still felt like a complete story. Here, not so much. I guess you can say Finding a New Home was a plot, and that's a complete story, but there are some really interesting mysteries that come up in the game that I wanted to find out, and I couldn't wait to find out, only to discover they were not answered in the game. And so, again, like Deus Ex Mankind Divided, like The Order 1886, you have the beginning of an interesting story, but they don't complete it, and that, we are getting tired of that. We never like that. It doesn't work in movies, it doesn't work in games. You can set up a trilogy and still have a complete story in your first act. You can do that. So, and I didn't want Andromeda to be the beginning of a trilogy or a saga. I wanted it to be a complete story. That would have made it different from the trilogy. So the fact that they left me hanging when I wanted to know more, no, I'm just, stop with the beginnings of a story only, and give us complete stories in games and movies everywhere, and don't make us have to look at a book to find out because your game flopped because you didn't complete the story, you didn't you didn't put a lot of meat into your product. Another disappointing factor was the cat themselves. They didn't really interest me. You didn't need the cat. You didn't need the cat in the game at all. That would have made things much more interesting if they didn't have the cat, and the only enemies you fought were other factions, the Exiles, or the Remnant. That would have been enough. Finally, I'll mention, it does repeat a lot of the same plot points and ideas of the first game, but they don't quite do it as well as the first game. Now, no, I said this in a previous video, I'll mention it again briefly here. This does deserve its own video. And by the way, the making games the beginnings of a story and not telling a full story in a game is a video in itself worth telling as well. But I really miss Drew Karpyshyn. I think it's Carp. I really am going to butcher. I know I'm butchering his name. But bring Drew back, please. He's the reason that Mass Effect was great to begin with. Because he's the reason BioWare is known for great stories. He wrote Knights of the Old Republic, Jade Empire, Mass Effect 1, and co-wrote Mass Effect 2. I found out after I played this that this game was made by the multiplayer team of the third game. Also, I must mention this. There were new aspects that I did like. I liked the scanning. And when I wasn't forced to do platforming, I did like the jump move. It is a cool move. Now, the platforming was implemented poorly. It didn't need to be in a Mass Effect game, and I'll get into that in my frustrating part. But the ability to maneuver the way that you can in this game was cool. And the combat options, the new additions to combat, were fluid and great. Now we're going to get into the parts that I hated. First of all, they brought back the Mako. I know it's not called the Mako, it's the Nomad, but a Nomad is basically a gunless Mako. I always rushed through the Mako parts in the first game because I couldn't wait to get out of it because I didn't like the way it controlled. Now, I do admit the Nomad did control a bit better than the Mako at some parts, but there were still some parts where I was getting tossed around everywhere because the thing would go the opposite direction of where I wanted it to go. So, no, I didn't miss the vehicle sections, and I didn't want the Mako to come back. But here is the part I hated the most. The puzzles! Mass Effect has always had puzzles in the past, but they were light, and they were simple, and they didn't require much thought. There is a puzzle in this game involving 5 remnant controls that make no sense at all, and I almost quit because of it, because there was barely anything online to find. Luckily, I did find a video to give me the answer to that, but there's no way to solve it. No way, unless you're a genius. And when you have a game that holds your hand on almost every other app point in it, all of a sudden, to throw this at you in order to gain 100% viability in that world. Oh, and there were so many other frustrating moments. The platforming section, the platforming was so... It was trying to be Uncharted, but it's not as good as Uncharted. Mass Effect Andromeda was trying to be a different game than what it was at times. And whenever... Let's say you like me and you like my fiancé very much. If I started acting like my fiancé, you wouldn't like me as much. Why? Because I wasn't being me. When Mass Effect wasn't being Mass Effect, it stopped being fun. And I hated those points. I hated those times. Oh, it was awful. So many parts of the game were awful. The platforming, the puzzles, and also there's a world where there's combat non-stop. So if you're trying to do objectives, oh, you can't because you have more combat to do. I'm sorry, but Mass Effect is an RPG. It's not supposed to be a third-person shooter. So it only happens mainly in one world. It's only one world where that's a problem. But it might work if you want to level up. But I wanted to do objectives. I like Mass Effect's missions are paced so well because there's a decent amount of combat, but it's not overdone. You get a combat section, you get a section of exploration, and you get a section of dialogue, and they're distributed fairly well and evenly, and I like that. But when you're in this certain world where there's non-stop combat, you'll know which world I'm talking about once you get there if you've played it already. If you haven't played it already, you know it if you will play it. Where there's there's enemies virtually everywhere. And it gets to the point where you want to fast travel and you can't, even though you've unlocked all the forward stations. So those are the things that I hated about this game. But that one puzzle with the 5 remnant controls was the worst. And it almost made me hate the game overall. But luckily I was able to get past it. But the thing is when this game acts like a Mass Effect game, it is good for the most part. It's still, like I said, I played this game. I would stay up late playing this game till like 3 in the morning. I haven't done that this generation. except for one game, but that was because I was staying up all night anyway because of a nighttime job. But I'm not doing that anymore. But this is the game that caused me to lose sleep, because when it did work, it worked really well. I like the characters. I like the concepts. And I like the improvements to the combat. I did like the jumping maneuver ability. And let's see what else. And when it was Mass Effect, it was fine, and I was happy, and I was getting into it. But when it tried to be Uncharted, it failed miserably, and that was the biggest fault of it for me. There is another issue that I need to bring up, and that is the final act with the cat. That almost deflated the story. But luckily, after that is done, there is stuff that happens after that I can't spoil, that brought a smile to my face and brought it back. And that's what this game did overall. I would love it one moment and hate it the next. So, is this the best game in the series? No. Is this the worst game in the series? Yeah, but it's part of a great series. Is it worse than 3? Yes, in a lot of ways. But it still has a lot to love about it if you're a Mass Effect fan. So, can I recommend this or not? Well, all I can say is, and this is hard for me to review, what works was great. What they got right was wonderful. But what they got wrong was terrible. And so this really is a mixed bag of greatness and garbage. No in between. No, it had very high points, but very low points for me as well. One more thing I wanted to mention, the bugs. The bugs didn't bother me. I didn't have too much, none of them were game breaking for me, and I didn't really have too much of a problem. I will say this, the bugs, there's no excuse for these type of bugs when you've worked on a game for 5 years. If you work on a game for 5 years and you have this many bugs, I'm getting the feeling that there's a problem with the Frostbite engine itself, because this is not the only game that's used it that had problems with Frostbite. So I'm beginning to wonder if maybe Frostbite is a fail altogether. But animations, I didn't mind. They were good in certain points. The game looked great in certain parts, certain environments, certain textures were great, and others not so much. And also, I gotta say, the thing that was so disappointing about the final act with the cat was that there was like no intensity at all. Like, I literally just sat in cover at the right points until I had to push certain buttons, and that did it. And that was like, really? There was no intensity at all, because there were parts earlier in the game that were way more intense than the final act, and I think that's a pacing issue. Either way, Ket was disappointing, incomplete, having the game just be another setup is disappointing and annoying, no excuse for bugs, frustrating puzzles and platforming that were out of place, liked the scanning, enjoyed the new abilities, characters I enjoyed, the downtime was phenomenal and one of my favorite parts. Again, I love and hate this game, both simultaneously. So, do I recommend it? If you're a Mass Effect fan, if you can bite your tongue and bear through it, go ahead. But otherwise, you might want to reconsider. This is Mike. I gotta go. Bye.